Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Court of Bitter Thorn by L Moody, narrated by Davies. Chapter 1. Swords came first. Love could come later, maybe never, but Elora would die before she went a day without lifting her sword. Her father usually sparred with her, but now that he was too busy arranging her marriage to a rich old merchant, she'd just have to find a new partner herself. Her blade sliced through the brittle red leaves that clung to a bush by her home. Each gave a soft crunch before drifting to the cracked dirt below. The chilly air cooled her brow as she swung the sword again. The leaves would have fallen on their own in another week or two. That made it less satisfying to chop them away, but it was also less destructive. When only bare branches remained on the bush, she took her sword to the trunk of a nearby tree. The sharp metal of her sword cut into the rough wood. Chips of bark flew as she ripped her sword away to do it again. It didn't take long for the trunk to be covered in gashes. Her mother would have sighed at the sight of it. Her father would have chuckled. None of it made Elora feel any better. She let out a huff as she sliced the tops off a lovely clump of wildflowers. Was it normal to be so angry while waiting to meet one's betrothed? The mere thought caused her simmering emotions to bubble up. Though her bottom lip trembled, she refused to acknowledge anything but the sword in her hand. It cut through the air, this time slicing another bush that had red leaves trying to hold on for dear life. Even after the leaves had been eradicated, her sword continued to spin and slice. The muscles in her arms ached, but that wouldn't stop her from swinging the blade like her life depended on it. Anything to keep the tears at bay. When her sword glanced against a tree instead of against its intended target of a bush, a shudder ripped through her shoulders. Pain stung through her throat when she tried to swallow. Her arms slumped to her sides, feeling heavier than usual. Hard pants puffed from her mouth, while drops of sweat trickled down her neck. Gripping her sword hilt tight, she pressed her forehead against the nearest tree trunk. Its familiar scent of rich bark and sticky sap wafted into her nose. Would her new home have trees that smelled the same? Her lip was trembling. Again. With a sniff, she shoved herself away from the tree and slid her silver blade inside its sheath. The belt that was wrapped around the bottom of her leather corset held the weight of the sheath and sword, distributing it evenly across her hips. Even in the brisk air, her skin felt too warm. She wrinkled her nose at the limp fabric covering her arms. The long-sleeved underslip might have been lightweight, but it always got in the way when she used her sword. Her woolen skirt she didn't mind. She'd learned to fight in a skirt years ago. The leather corset actually helped her sword skill, since it acted as a torso support and as a kind of armor. But the linen underslip? She would have sliced the long sleeves right off if she hadn't been certain her mother would faint at the sight. And perhaps Elora should have been more concerned about her appearance, considering she was about to meet her future husband and all. At least the rich purple dye in her skirt had lasted longer than her family's wealth. And at least it still fit her. Her light brown hair hung freely down her back in gentle waves. It wasn't a common hairstyle. No braids, combs, or even a ribbon. But she had only been able to make so many concessions when getting ready that morning. Hopefully her betrothed liked long hair. A lump pricked her throat, which would have been easier to ignore if tears hadn't puddled in her eyes at the same moment. She blinked them away before they could fall. It didn't change how her corset seemed too tight, and her heart seemed too heavy. Ignoring those things, she traced a finger over the leather-wrapped hilt of her sword. There was no reason to be emotional anyway. This was a marriage, not a death sentence. With her 18th birthday a month away, she had been hoping for a little more time at home, a little more time to be free. But her father's forge was close to ruin, and her marriage was the only thing that could save it. And her family. Mother always said Elora was lucky for being so beautiful. Now her beauty would buy a husband who could save her parents and 2 younger sisters from financial ruin. All she had to give in return was her entire self to a complete stranger. Lucky indeed. The veins in her hand pulsed as she gripped her sword hilt tighter. She forced deep breaths in and out of her nose, urging her heart to stop racing. It refused. Why could her heart do whatever it wanted, but her head still had to accept marriage? Before her thoughts could spin too far out of control, she reached under her corset for a reminder of her one last goal. She wanted to win her very own sword-fighting tournament. Of course, women were not allowed to participate, but she had been preparing for this goal for weeks. To hide in plain sight at the tournament grounds, she just needed the right clothes. With a gentle tug, she pulled a piece of parchment out from under her corset. Handling the parchment gently, she smoothed out the creases as she traced a finger over the drawing. Thin pencil lines and colored paint combined to portray a knight in full armor. Her father had recently acquired a full book of drawings that depicted life in a nearby castle. The images and descriptions of the gardens and clothing were captivating, but this drawing of the knight was her favorite. Letting her finger linger over the knight's sword, she carefully studied his stance. Years of sword training with her father taught her plenty about correct stance. Still, the man in the drawing somehow seemed nobler and more gallant than her. Straightening her back, she unsheathed her sword and attempted to stand in the same position, as it had been doing a lot lately. The air hung stagnant all around with no hint of breeze. She made her own wind by swiping the sword diagonally in front of her body. In her mind, the leather corset and woolen skirt were gone. Instead, she imagined herself wearing a heavy suit of chainmail with a belted white tunic on top. Matching clothes sat in a dusty trunk in her father's forge. His old tournament clothes might be recognized by others in their village, but they were the only men's clothes she had access to. They would have to do. Her eyes remained closed as she struck her sword forward in lethal jabs. After a moment, she peeked through one eyelid at the drawing of the knight. She adjusted her feet to match the stance and closed her eyes to move again. When she slashed her sword through the air again, she didn't just imagine herself in the clothes. Now she imagined herself standing across from Theobald, the greatest sword fighter and sword maker the land had ever seen. His prowess was well known due to all the tournaments he'd won. Theobald was also her father, though she imagined a slightly younger version of him to fight against. Age had caught up to him now, but her father had once boasted incredible sword skill. During her childhood, he spent as many days forging new swords as competing in dangerous sword-fighting tournaments. She remembered sitting on her mother's knee in a crowded arena while her father effortlessly beat any opponent who crossed him. When Elora's skirt rippled around her legs, her arms dropped to her sides again. The illusion vanished in a heartbeat. Even with the right clothes, she still might not get away with sneaking into a tournament, and too many people would be angry if they found out. That gloomy truth always crept around the corners of her mind, but she did her best to ignore it. No matter what everyone else thought about a woman wielding a sword, she had to participate in a tournament. At least once. For a single moment, the air sizzled around her. Hairs prickled at the back of her neck while the sensation of being watched flooded through her. Before she could glance into the woods, a strong gust of wind blew the drawing of the knight out of her hand. Her eyes flew open as she jumped to snatch the parchment from the air. Instead, another gust carried it past the clearing where she had been practicing. In only a moment, it drifted toward the front of her family's cottage. Despite the dirt and leaves she had to trudge through, Elora raced toward her drawing without question. As a tangible reminder of the tournament she hoped to win, nothing could stop her from protecting that parchment. Her feet tripped over crunchy leaves and dry twigs. The page finally stopped flying when it wrapped itself around the front leg of a chestnut-brown horse. Her husband-to-be had arrived on that same horse not long ago. He and her parents were still discussing the particulars of the upcoming marriage. The horse probably wouldn't appreciate a stranger grabbing at its leg, but she needed that paper. Heavy thumps pounded in her chest as she reached out. Her fingers pinched over the page just as the horse snorted with a distressed neigh. Its teeth chomped down, nearly taking a chunk out of her arm. She had stepped back just in time. Despite the pounding pulse that strummed through her, a smile tugged at her lips. She held the drawing against her heart for a beat before folding it and tucking it neatly underneath her corset. The horse continued to neigh, but her relief seemed to calm it slightly. She took a step back and lowered her head. Reaching out a flat palm, She let the creature sniff her until its muscles relaxed. Elora. Her mother appeared through the front door of their cottage, wearing her finest blue shawl. She gave a pointed grimace at Elora's dust-covered hem before turning back toward the inside of the cottage. I discovered the cause of the horse's fright. Elora must have been eager to meet it. While the sound of footsteps neared, Elora shook her skirt to loosen most of the dirt. Her back had only just straightened when a man appeared in the doorway beside her mother. The beam on her mother's face could have brightened a moonless night. Elora, meet Dietrich Mercer, your betrothed. A curtsy came automatically. Elora could only hope it hid the scowl taking over her features. By the time she rose from the curtsy, her father had joined the others. He closed the door of the cottage behind him as the three of them stepped toward her. Mr. Mercer was shorter than her father and had less defined features. His round belly poked out above his belt. He did have a fine head of curly blonde hair, which paired nicely with his bright blue eyes. But it looked as though the most intense sport he had ever performed was writing a letter. At least he wasn't as old as her father. The man was much closer to her father's age than to hers, but he still had a bit of youth in him. Heat flushed into her cheeks when he nodded his head in return. Somehow, she managed to stop herself from reaching for her sword hilt. Instead, her sweaty palm stroked over the horse's chestnut mane. I apologize if I acted out of turn, but your horse caught my eye. Such a beautiful creature. Mother always said flattery could smooth over anything. Mr. Mercer must have agreed, because the slightest smile twitched at his lips. You have a good eye. He glanced up and down her body as he spoke, but at least he had the decency to pretend he was eyeing his horse. This mare has strong legs that have carried me through many villages. It can carry a cart full of wares all by itself. How impressive. Her mother touched a hand to her necklace as her jaw dropped. That caused a bigger grin on Mr. Mercer's face before he turned to look at Elora again. But I usually take 2 horses, so I don't put so much strain on this one. What a humane thing to do. Somehow, Elora had adopted her mother's dulcet tone. Getting married to a stranger was the last thing she wanted, but she didn't want to upset her betrothed during their first meeting either. Mr. Mercer stepped forward to rub between the horse's eyes. He gave her the briefest glance before staring back at his horse. Once we marry, perhaps we could go horseback riding together. I have a lovely meadow where the flowers bloom beautifully. His blue eyes flicked toward her again, this time looking brighter than before. She allowed one corner of her mouth to tilt up in a smile. I'd like that. The most surprising thing about her statement was that it actually held truth. The words seemed to give him courage. He reached into the leather pouch hanging from the horse's saddle. I brought you a book from my library. A tiny gasp escaped her when he dropped a thick leather-bound book into her hands. You have a library? His chest puffed out as he nodded. Yes, your father said you'd like that. She glanced back at her father, whose thinning brown hair looked wispy over his head. He gave a short nod that said more than words could have. He had promised to find her a good husband, and so far, things weren't as bad as they could have been. Her father cleared his throat and gave a pointed look toward her betrothed. And you said you had a bit of woods where she can practice her sword fighting every day, correct? Red burned through Mr. Mercer's neck and face. He ducked his head and looked studiously at his horse's mane. Yes, I can provide for your... He glanced at Elora through the side of his eye. Eccentricities. She tightened a fist, but did it beneath the folds of her skirt. Her father had promised to find her someone who would let her continue to practice her sword skill. She should have known her betrothed would only barely be able to tolerate it. Still, eccentric was one of the better words used to describe her skill. Most people considered it downright unseemly for a woman to know how to wield a sword. Mr. Mercer cleared his throat and looked deeper into his horse's mane. As long as the sport doesn't interfere with her childbearing. Her muscles stiffened at once. It was lucky her betrothed continued to stare at his horse. He wouldn't have liked the scowl that screwed up her face. It wasn't that she found marriage or children inherently disgusting, but this conversation made her feel less like a person and more like an object in some business arrangement. When her mother invited everyone back inside to discuss the details, only Elora's body accompanied them. Her mind was off imagining a tournament. In it, she wore chainmail and boots, and no one criticized her for carrying a sword. Then again, in her father's old clothes, no one knew she was a woman either. The thoughts brought a smile to her lips. They could make her get married, but they couldn't take away her dream. Before her wedding, she'd sneak into a tournament, no matter what the cost. That same strange sensation of being watched prickled over her skin again. Rather than fearing it, she found herself longing for it. Maybe someone new in her life was just what she needed. She'd welcome any number of new people, as long as she could fight them with her sword. Chapter 2. Grime gathered in the edges of the forge. Elora collected her father's tools and set them in a pile next to him so he could clean each one. While he worked, she wiped away the dirt and soot that covered the wooden counters and walls. The tip of her boot bumped an old trunk under one counter. She spared a quick glance toward it while her father shook out a rag. The dust on the trunk's surface had been undisturbed for many months at least. Good. Her father wouldn't even notice when she stole his old clothes out of it. She couldn't do it while he sat in the forge with her, but maybe she could sneak in that night after everyone had gone to bed. With her wedding drawing nearer, she was running out of time to get into a tournament like she had always dreamed. Plucking a tool from the ground, her father scrubbed it with the polishing rag.
Mr. Mercer promised to recommend my skills in every village he visits. As a merchant, he has extensive influence. I expect I'll have plenty of work before winter comes.
She nodded at her father's words, but kept wiping the counters without a word. How wonderful that her imprisonment with the merchant would improve her father's business. As soon as the thought struck her, a wrinkle scrunched up her nose. She loved her father more than anyone. She was grateful her marriage could help him, but why couldn't she help without being tied down to a boring life she didn't even want?
I know he isn't perfect.
With such a sturdy build and rough hands, it felt out of place when her father used a tender voice.
But Dietrich Mercer is a good man. Those who know him personally only have good things to say about him, and he is very wealthy.
How could she be ungrateful when her father had tried so hard to find her a good match? I suppose he seemed kind. Her heart tightened as she forced the words out. The muscles in her father's arms rippled as he cleaned the grime away from his hammer.
I know he acted uncomfortable about your sword skill when you met him, but he promised me it wouldn't be a problem. He said he would let you continue to practice every day if you wanted. He even said he'd let you teach his scullery maid so you can have a sparring partner.
Apparently, the soreness in her throat was a permanent fixture these days. She swallowed over a hard lump, but the tightness only grew. In a soft voice, she braved the response she'd been forming for weeks. I know it's a good match, but is it wrong for me to dream of something more? Having sword skill isn't enough. I want a chance to use that skill. Her chin trembled through each of the words. Dropping his hammer, her father came near. When she spoke again, her voice broke. Is marriage the greatest adventure I'll ever have? Her mother appeared in the doorway of the forge just as her father pulled Elora into a tight embrace. Emotion spilled out of her before she could stop it. Tears soaked her father's wool tunic. His shoulders had caught so many of her tears, but soon she'd have only a stranger to turn to in times of pain. As kind as Mr. Mercer acted, he didn't seem the type to offer great comfort. How could anyone replace her father's strong arms and steady heart? Her mother must have come inside the forge because now she stroked Elora's arm. Don't you remember the story of when your father and I left at the castle? I was a court musician, the finest harp player in generations. Your father was renowned castle blacksmith. But when we married each other, We chose to move to the country so we could raise our family away from the dangers and politics of the castle." The words did nothing to temper Elora's tears. Her two younger sisters had always found their parents' story romantic, but to Elora, it just seemed sad. Her parents had once lived exciting lives, and they gave it all up for each other. It only further confirmed her belief that marriage was the opposite of adventure. It could never beat the thrill of a tournament. When the tears slowed, her father held Elora by the shoulders and looked her in the eye.
"Your betrothed promised he would buy you a new book in every village he ever visits."
Her mother offered a smile as she nudged Elora in the arm. "And his merchant business has afforded him a large estate. Even if you hate him, he'll always be provided for." Elora wrenched her shoulders away from her father's grip. She wrapped an arm over her stomach and began pinching the skin on her opposite elbow. "But what if he doesn't treat me well?" Despite her father's insistence, Mr. Mercer hadn't acted happy about the sword fighting. A crease formed in her father's forehead.
"Dietrich has a good reputation. His neighbors—"
But her mother cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Take comfort, Elora. If Mr. Mercer does anything to hurt you, your father will just stab him." The sound that escaped Elora's mouth wasn't quite a gasp, but it wasn't quite a laugh either. "Mother!" What a change for her to be the one scolding. Her mother shrugged, but it didn't hide the smile dancing beneath her lips. "Only if his actions warrant it, of course. Mr. Mercer knows your father's reputation." She hooked an arm through her husband's and looked up at him with a wink. "He knows what your father is capable of." Her father shook his head at the words, but he also stood a little taller. With a smirk, he gestured toward Elora.
"She's better than me with a sword now, Cecily. She could stab him herself if needed."
Her mother responded by fluttering her eyelashes. "Yes, you did tell me that, didn't you?" She pulled his arm closer. "But I know you could still take him easily." Elora covered her eyes with one hand as she let out an exasperated sigh. Being in love was probably wonderful and all, but did her parents have to be so ridiculous around her? By the time she moved her hand away from her face, her parents had stepped apart. "The point is," her mother said while reaching out to squeeze her hand, "even after you marry, you will always be our daughter." The world felt warmer then. Or softer, maybe. Comfort surrounded Elora despite the harsh realities all around. Swallowing over the largest lump in her throat yet, she reached out to embrace her parents. They responded with even tighter hugs. Footsteps shuffled across the floor. When Elora pulled away from her parents, she saw her two younger sisters standing in the doorway to the forge. It wasn't unusual for everyone to be in the forge, but they did come here a lot more lately. They were trying a little too hard to keep Elora in good spirits. Still, the effort brought comfort. With a prim stance, Elora's middle sister Chloe held her hands behind her back and fluttered her eyelashes. She had inherited more mannerisms from their mother than either of the other two sisters. "Will you come with Grace and me into the village, Elora? The bookstore is supposed to get another book of poems today, and I'm dying to take a look." Without missing a beat, Elora narrowed one eye. "And will Alistair be at the bookstore too? Are you sure you aren't going just to see him?" Right on cue, Chloe's fair skin turned a bright red. It stood out against her softly curled blonde hair. "It's not just because of Alistair." Her lips pursed as she tried to suppress a smile. "But I won't complain if he is there." Alistair Rolfe was only one of many young men Chloe had her eye on. She didn't love any one of them more than the others. Rather, she was in love with the idea of being in love. Why couldn't Chloe be the oldest and have her marriage arranged? She was dying to get married. At 15, she didn't have too much longer to wait. From behind Chloe, Grace's bright face appeared. Her reddish-brown hair was swept up in a loose bun. It was her attempt at appearing older than her actual age of 12. "Please come, Elora. I want to tell my friend how you finally started learning the harp duet with me." Grace acted a bit childish, but her enthusiasm for life couldn't be denied. She was also more driven than her two older sisters when it came to music. Despite being the youngest, she was the most accomplished harp player between them. Only their mother had greater skill. Mention of the duet brought a pit to Elora's stomach. She had just recently promised to learn the duet, and only because her time was running out. Soon she'd be married and living in an all-new village. With her impending marriage, she didn't have long to perfect the duet she had always promised Grace she would learn. A smile accompanied her red cheeks as Chloe skipped across the floor and hooked an arm around Elora's. "Please, please, please. You know Mother won't let us visit the village without you."
"You should go."
Father brushed a knuckle across Elora's cheek and pointed his chin toward the doorway.
"It will give you time to look over this letter."
He pushed a folded piece of parchment into her hands. It felt as heavy as iron. Even before looking, she knew it had come from her betrothed. Her mother placed a hand over Elora's and gave her a gentle nod. Even at her age, her mother's blonde hair only looked slightly duller than Chloe's. "Mr. Mercer would like you to pick the wedding date. He asks that you send your response soon." Elora's heart sank as she clasped the letter in her hand. The very strong desire to burn the letter came over her. If the drawing of the night had still been under her corset, she would have reached for it. Now it was inside her room in the cottage. Instead, she glanced at the trunk holding her father's old tournament clothes. Her breath caught at the sight of it. Soon, when her father pulled something from his pocket, his face said, "Peace offering." A moment later, he dropped a leather pouch filled with coins onto her palm. She must have made a face at the sight of it, because her father pushed it toward her and turned away. Apparently, she wouldn't be allowed to ask where the money had come from. Considering her mother's neck, which almost always sported a necklace, was now bare, Elora had a pretty good guess. Nausea twisted through her at the thought. Chloe tugged her toward the door before she could think about it too much. A tiny squeak of protest came from their mother as they reached the doorway. With lips pursed to a straight line, her mother's face scrunched up in a wince. "Must you wear your sword into the village, Elora? Couldn't you leave it here in the forge?" The tears that had spilled earlier threatened to make another appearance. Elora's heart pounded in her chest. Of all times, now was not the best moment to be reminded how unseemly she was for having skill with a sword. Not when she had to choose a wedding date for a marriage to a man she barely knew. She glanced toward her father. As always, his eyes softened at the sight of her distress. He let out a resigned sigh.
"Oh, let her take the sword. She already has a husband picked out. What harm could it do?"
That prompted a series of giggles from Chloe and Grace as they finally left the forge. Neither of them had ever been interested in sword fighting, and they never seemed eager to get their father to fight for them the way Elora did. But they did find it highly amusing that their father always took Elora's side and never their mother's. Luckily, their mother found it charming how her husband always had a soft spot for their oldest daughter. Even she let out a soft chuckle as the sisters left the forge. By the time Elora and her sisters made it to the road, Chloe was already thick into an explanation about the epic poem she had most recently read. "It says Faerie has but one rule, and that is to never give away your heart. Well, technically, the first rule is to never enter a bargain, but everyone seems to break that one, so I don't think it counts. Besides, giving away one's heart seems so much worse." Chloe swept a blonde cluster of curls over one shoulder while letting out a long sigh. "If I ever met a fae, or even a dwarf, I would almost certainly fall in love with it." Grace let out another giggle as she clasped her hands under her chin. "I'd like to meet a dryad. Didn't you read us a poem that said dryads are wise? Maybe a dryad could teach me why Mother's fingers move more delicately across harp strings than mine do." Elora shook her head as they moved up the beaten path that led to the village. The stagnant air barely seemed able to hold a chill. "I can tell you why Mother's hands seem more delicate. It's only because she has more experience than you, Grace. You are already better than Chloe and me. It won't take long until you're just as good as Mother." With a mischievous smirk, Chloe leaned closer to their youngest sister. "But it would be more believable if you heard it from a dryad, wouldn't it?" Grace clapped both hands over her mouth as she tried to stifle yet another laugh. Shaking her head again, Elora said, "Faerie is only a myth." As she spoke, her thumb absently reached out for her other hand. She rubbed her thumb over a strange scar that sat on the fleshy part of her hand between her pointer finger and thumb. Not that long ago, She would have scolded Chloe for putting such fanciful notions into their youngest sister's head. But
Sample complete. Ready to continue?